Welcome, everyone, if you're joining us right now. This is our Drisha class today, a Vayikra, a guide to relationships with Miss Rachael Gelfman Schultz. So happy to be learning together again for our second week of this class. And welcome also to those who are watching us live on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Evie. So today we're going to be talking about Nadav and Avihu, but I wanted to talk first about a larger theme that connects what we learned last week about Trumat Hadeshen and what we're going to learn this week about Nadav and Avihu, which is the theme of. Oh, hello, Sivan. I'm going to talk about your question, Sivan. I don't know if you can hear me yet. A larger theme of fire and God as manifest in fire. And that connects both Trumat Hadeshen, which we learned about last week, and Nadav and Avihu, which we're going to learn about this week. So I wanted to start. Okay. And by the way, I think that just to make things smoother, I'm going to, obviously I can't call on the attendings to read, but on the panelists, I might just call on you to read. And if you feel uncomfortable reading, you can either say no when I ask you, or you could just write to me now that not to call on you and I won't call on you, but just to read in English, just to make things move faster. So I'm going to start with a passage by Professor Jonathan Grossman, which we ended up with last week, but we didn't really have a time to look at in depth. This is actually a different part of the article than what we looked at last week, talking about the significance of Trumat Hadeshen. Why is Trumat Hadeshen so holy? Maureen, you want to read?
Yeah. Taking up the ashes is a symbol representing the encounter between God and people that takes place on the altar. The ashes result from the encounter between the offering brought by people and God, who is revealed on the altar as the fire that consumes. This encounter between flesh and fire produces ashes, which the priest, the Kohen, takes up each morning, and in so doing points to the covenant and grace that are present in this place. According to this understanding, taking up the ashes is connected to clearing off the altar. But the moment before removing the leftovers, there's a declaration regarding the unique encounter that takes place in this sacred spot by pointing to its results, an encounter between flesh and fire that produces ashes.
Okay, thanks. So in other words, why is Trumat Hadeshen so holy? The reason it is so holy is that because it is basically the results or the leftovers, which is also an interesting word, the leftovers, which we're going to see again in the story of Nadav and Avihu in several contexts. But it's the result of this encounter between God, as represented by the fire that comes and consumes the sacrifice, and people that bring the sacrifice. So like, and that's what makes it so holy, because this is like the physical residue of this encounter. So today we're going to look a bit more in depth about this image of God as, or this manifestation of God as a fire that consumes. So where else, just before where else do we see, where else in the Torah do we see God as represented as a fire? Yeah, Maureen?
In the burning bush?
Exactly. Okay. So we're going to get to that. The burning bush is a very good example. And there actually, though, is a fire that does not consume, right? That's what's so interesting about the burning bush, which we'll get to in a minute. In other words, generally, fire consumes. That's what it does. And that's what that's what the fire is doing here, here with the sacrifice. But the burning bush is unique in that it's a fire that does not consume. Okay, so that's a great example, which we'll look at inside in a minute. Any other examples that anyone can think of? So here in Exodus, right, we said, now the presence of God appeared in the sight of the Israelites as a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. And it's the same language of Eish Ochelet, which is consuming fire. Right, so here we're talking about Mount Sinai. right? And God manifests himself on Mount Sinai as a consuming fire. Now, what, of course, does anyone remember what the people's reaction is to beholding God as a consuming fire on Mount Sinai?
They afraid?
Yeah, they're afraid, exactly. They say, you want to read hold on. You want to read this is a passage from Deuteronomy. Also, when Moses is retelling the story of what happened on Mount Sinai. You want to read this passage?
When you
Yeah.
heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, you came up to me, all your tribal heads and elders, and said, Hashem, our God, has just shown us a majestic presence, and we have heard God's voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that humankind may live, though addressed by God. Let us not die then, for this fearsome fire will consume us.
Right. So again, just to pause, right? Again, it's the same kind of language of the fire consuming. I mean, literally in Hebrew, eating. Okay, keep going.
If we hear the voice of Hashem our God any longer, we shall die. For what mortal ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? You go closer and hear all that Hashem our God says, and then you tell us everything that Hashem our God tells you, and we will willingly do it. Hashem heard the plea that you made to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the plea that this people made to you. They did well to speak thus.
Exactly. So they say, we can't deal, like, this is too scary for us. If we get any closer, we'll die, which is very interesting in terms of foreshadowing, in terms of what's going to happen with the story of Nadav and Abihu. They're scared. If we get any closer to the fire, we'll die. And here, again, the Hebrew is ki tochalnu ha'esh ha'gedolah hazot. They're worried that this great fire, and they say fearsome in English, but it's really just great, huge fire will consume them if they get too close. So they say, Moshe, you go. You can get close to this fire, but we can't. It's too scary. It's too dangerous, right? Which is very interesting, going back to the example that Maureen brought of the burning bush, right? So the burning bush says, a messenger of God appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He saw it, and behold, the bush was burning in fire, but the bush was not consumed. Again, the same language, hasneh enenu ukal, like literally the bush was not eaten, right? So Rashi on this says, what is this symbol of the burning bush coming to tell us? And the vision you have seen in the bush will be your sign that it was I who sent you, and I am capable of saving. Just as you have seen the bush fulfilling my mission without being consumed, so you will go on my holy mission without being damaged. So in other words, that Moshe himself is like the bush who's not consumed, right? The burning bush, Moshe is representative of the bush, and he is like the only one who can go before this fire of God and not be consumed and sort of survive it without being, as the words that Rashi uses, without being damaged. Yeah, so to sum up, before we go into our main story of Nadav and Abihu, so if we're talking, God obviously has many manifestations in the Bible, many ways that we relate to God's presence. But this particular manifestation of fire, how would you summarize it in terms of our relation, what it says about this aspect of our relationship with God?
It's like we need an intermediary.
Right, it's like we can't do
Too
it.
scared to do it directly.
Right, we're too scared to do it directly. We need an intermediary. It's like too much, right? Like we need, we're scared. Yeah, we need an intermediary, which is very.
And we need to ask permission, not just once, but twice, really. There's the approach, and then you sort of ask permission.
You're talking about in the story of the burning, in the story of Mount Sinai?
Right, well, yes, in particular there.
Mm-hmm. Right, so it's like we need an intermediary.
Some sort of reassurance.
Right. And we need permission, right? Which is also going to be very relevant in the Nadav and Abihu story. Either we're scared to go, we need someone else to go for us, or if we maybe are brave enough to go, we first ask permission because it's scary and we want God to sort of give us his go ahead, as it were. Okay, so let's now, with that background in mind, and this image of God as fire is, is all over Vayikra, not only Vayikra, but specifically Vayikra. So it's a important image to keep in mind. So let's look at our main story. Now, this story of Nadav and Avihu, we're going to look at mainly the beginning of the story. The rest of it is really fascinating as well, but we'll see. Maybe we'll get to it in a later class. But so Nadav and Avihu, the story occurs on the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, which is the 8th day. So they do 7 days of intense preparation, and then we get to the 8th day. And these last 2 verses of chapter 9, which we're about to see, is like the pinnacle of the inauguration of the Mishkan. And then it goes straight from there to the story of Nadav and Avihu. What's interesting is that even though here there's a chapter break, this chapter break is actually like the chapter breaks come later historically, and there's no break in terms of like the parshiot, the spaces in the Torah scroll. So in terms of the Torah, this whole story, going from the inauguration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, into the story of Nadav and Avihu is one narrative. And it's important to keep that in mind when we're trying to understand the story of Nadav and Avihu. In other words, it's very essential that it happened on the 8th day. It happened on the day in which the tabernacle was inaugurated. Okay, so does someone want to read the story? Again, we're just going to be reading right now the beginning part of the story. Yeah, Donna, good to see you.
Okay. Moses and Aaron then went into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the presence of God appeared to all the people. Fire came forth from before God and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. And all the people saw and exulted and fell on their faces. Now Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before God strange fire that was not commanded them. And fire came forth from before God and consumed them. And they died in the presence of God. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what God meant by saying, 'Through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. In the presence of the whole people, I shall make my gravity felt.'" And Aaron
was silent. You went silent for the last.
Aaron was silent, right? I don't know why that turned off. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so there are a lot of questions to ask here, but I want to start like we started last time. Oops, sorry about that. With just throwing out questions. Like last time, we're not going to get to all the questions. There's a certain direction, obviously, that I want to go in. But just to start getting us thinking about this passage, just to throw out any questions that you have.
We discussed, I think, this in my Talmud class, I think, or maybe it was at Schultz. I don't remember, and I'm trying to remember what we came up with. But one thing is maybe the harshness of a punishment from a merciful God.
Yes, right. In other words, what did they do so wrong that they deserve such a harsh punishment? I mean, this is, I think, probably one of, if not the key, at least one of the key questions in this passage. Like, there's nothing obvious in the story that would cause them to just, to deserve the fire coming forth and consuming them and dying. They offered before God a strange fire that was not commanded by them. In other words, what is so, obviously they weren't commanded, that's bad, but what is so bad about it that deserves such a punishment? We're not going to exactly find an answer to that question, because I think ultimately the question is better than the answer, but we will definitely explore that question. Yeah, what else? What other questions?
So was this some sort of sanctification? Because you could interpret it
Mhm.
through those who are close to me, shall I be sanctified? So was this some sort of a korban or something?
Sanctifying what? What would you?
Their death sanctifies him, like they were martyrs for some reason, or
Mhm.
like, is there a connection between that, him, God killing them, and the sanctification idea?
Exactly, right? And also the sanctification of the tabernacle that's going on at this very day, right? What does this mean? This is what God meant by saying, through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified, which my mother is interpreting as Nadav and Abihu, which I think is the obvious interpretation, though we will see that's not the only interpretation. But something about their deaths seems to be sanctifying God, or maybe also I'll put in like the tabernacle, possibly, like what's going on, and how could their deaths be sanctifying? Like, what does that even mean? Why would their deaths sanctify? Seems a strange thing to be necessary to sanctify God or the tabernacle. Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you. Yeah, any other questions?
What does the presence of God mean?
Yeah, you want to explain that? And that's a big question in general, but yeah, you want to explain in particular here, like what are you?
Well, I'm not sure I can explain it, but it brings to mind that God is localized, that there's places where you're in the presence of God and places where you're not.
Right, which is a key question for all of Vayikra, really. I mean, Vayikra is all about the sanctity of place, which is something that, nowadays it's a difficult thing for us to understand, that this place is holy, that some place is more in the presence of God than other places. Yeah, and what does that mean in particular here, that their death, that it was necessary to say that they died in the presence of God. And they died, right? And they died in the presence of God. Yeah. What does that mean?
And God also
Okay.
said, I shall make my gravity felt. So did he feel like because all these people were there, he had to make, it had to make some sort of point by doing something really serious?
Mhm.
So maybe if it had been some other setting, maybe God wouldn't have chosen this particular action. Like he really had to impress something upon the people, maybe.
Right. So what does that mean? I shall make my gravity felt. What lesson is God trying to convey? And how is it connected again to like the day that it's the inauguration of the tabernacle? Okay, great. Anything else, or should I have one other big question that nobody else
I mean,
said.
I'm always struck with this passage about the silence of Aaron.
Yes,
That
exactly.
it's his sons, and he has nothing to say about this.
Right. What does that mean? His two sons just died, and he's silent. Like, what is going on? Yeah. He has nothing to say. I mean, maybe that's what it means. He has nothing to say about it. I mean, we'll see that there are lots of, yeah, but what is going on here? How is Aaron responding in silence to such a, horrible tragedy? Yeah, exactly. What does that mean? Yeah, Donna.
Well, also, what does it mean? How does God show its presence? What does it mean in the presence of God?
Right. How do we know? Yes. Yeah. How does God manifest herself here? Right there. Yes, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. I think these are the main questions. We are not, so the original question, which I think is like one of the central questions of this story of what was Nadav and Abihu's sin, or what did they do to deserve this fate? I don't think that we are going to come to an answer to that question. And I'm not even really going to focus on that question, though we're going to, obviously, our discussion is going to touch a lot on that question, but I think ultimately we don't really know. Meaning we know that they brought a strange fire, but we don't really know what that means, why it is so bad. The rabbis give lots of possible answers. They say maybe they came in drunk. And we'll see late, because later on in the chapter they talk about don't enter the Holy of Holies drunk. So maybe that's what they did. Maybe they came in drunk. And there are other various explanations, but none of them are like very, in my eyes, very satisfying. So what we're actually going to focus on is more the last verse. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what God meant by saying, through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. In the presence of the whole people, I shall make my gravity felt." And Aaron was silent. So in other words, what is Aaron? Aaron seems to be trying to maybe comfort, Moses, I'm sorry, seems to be, what is Moses trying to say to Aaron here? Is he trying to comfort him? If so, how is he trying to comfort him? And what is Aaron's response that he's silent? Seems very puzzling and mysterious. So before we get to that, I just want to make one more point back connected to the fire question, which I think we're going to keep coming to, but a very interesting interpretation of Rashbam, who's the grandson of Rashi. So he sees himself like Rashi as like, finding the pshat, the simple meaning of the text. So he says, fire came forth before God from the Holy of Holies, first to the golden altar. Right. In order to burn the incense of offering there, the fire found Aaron's 2 sons there near the golden altar, and it burned them to death. Then the fire went out to the tabernacle, to the copper altar, where it consumed the burnt offerings and the fat on the altar. So the reason I wanted to bring this interpretation is that he switches the order, right? Because in the Torah, it says first the fire consumes the sacrifice, and then at the fire, and then we have the story of Nadab and Abihu. But here he's saying that actually that same fire it went out, like maybe probably to consume the sacrifices. Nadab and Abihu were sort of where they weren't supposed to be, consumed Nadab and Abihu, and then it consumed the sacrifices, which is like just a fascinating understanding of this fire. It's like actually, not only do both fires represent God in some way, but this is actually the same fire that it's on its path, first consumed Nadab and Abihu, and then consumed the sacrifices. Okay, so now we're going to start by looking at this question: what is Moshe saying to Aaron, and what's he trying to do here? Is he trying to comfort him? Does anyone have a read here? What is he trying to say when he says, "This is what God meant by saying, through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. In the presence of the whole people, I shall make my gravity felt"? So my mom started to talk a bit about that. Does anyone have any explanation what Moses could be trying to say to Aaron here? Any ideas?
Yeah, so I think, I've read a lot of interpretations of this, and, maybe this is saying that they were closer to God, and they had sort of, they'd sort of fulfilled their role in a way that, that's appalling, those of us who are parents, to think that, you've sort of reached whatever goals God had for you, and now your time, and now God was taking you as almost a good thing, maybe.
Exactly.
I don't. That
right.
That we think of the Kohanim as being closer to God, right? That's part of the reasons we have a Birkat Kohanim, right? That somehow they have some kind of special connection with God. And
right. Yeah. So in other words, Moses is trying to comfort Aaron. He's saying they didn't really sin, right? They actually just were the closest to God. And maybe like Maureen's saying that they fulfilled their mission, and now they were taking. It sounds like sometimes, and we'll get to that later on, but sometimes when someone dies young, people say things like this. rationalize whatever, right? Like they, you know, they did their mission, they finished their mission early, and like Maureen says, I also find it kind of appalling, but like they died because they were too close to God, not because they did something bad. And this is something we see in Chassidut. It's something, but it really, but it starts. I mean, one of the classic versions of this is in Rashi. Maureen, you want to read the Rashi, which is along these lines?
This is what God spoke there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oops.
Oops.
Hold on. Go ahead.
Okay. Where had God spoken this? In the statement, and there I will be met by the children of Israel, and it, the tabernacle, shall be sanctified by my glory. Bikvodi. Read not here bikvodi, by my glory, but what is this word?
Mechubadai.
Makubadi. Makubadi? Makubadi. Yeah, through my honored ones.
Yeah.
My
mechubadim. My
mechubadim. Yeah. Okay. Moshe here said to Aharon, my brother Aharon, I knew that this house was to be sanctified by those who are beloved of the omnipresent God. And I thought it would be either through me or through you. Now I see that these, your sons who have died, are greater than me and than you.
Yeah, so this is the classic version of what Maureen's interpretation, right? That somehow, and this also fits in with what we were talking about the fact that that there's no space between the two stories. In other words, this is like the narrative necessity, right? This is where somehow the inauguration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, required a death. I mean, it's horrible. It's like horrible to think about, but like they knew ahead of time that someone was going to die in order to sanctify the tabernacle. And Moses thought maybe it would be him, maybe it would be Aaron, but really, like, the ones who were the best and the closest to God were Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, and they were the ones to die. And he's trying to comfort Aaron by saying,
Yeah, here I imagine Aharon says nothing because he's thinking to himself, are you out of your mind? Like he's like,
so that's one possibility. Yes. So according to Rashi, so that is, yes, definitely one possible reason that he says absolutely nothing. Are you out of your mind? Like, okay, that was a crazy idea, Moses. I'm not even going to dignify that with the response, but Rashi does not think that. Rashi thinks that he's silent because he says, oh, thanks, that was good comfort, I'm going to be silent. And he's rewarded for his silence. In other words, he's like, I didn't bring that part of Rashi, but he's quiet because he accepts what Moshe says, and he's rewarded for that quietness because he's like not challenging God's will. So it's a trouble. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I refer back to the reading in Vayikra, where I think they had a hard, I'm not sure where the translation comes from, but it had a hard time translating it, the word ekaved, that shall make my gravity felt, and then the word kavod obviously is used again in Rashi, and there's a little bit of contrast between kadosh and kavod, but the word kavod, I mean, they use gravity. I mean, not only is it something that is honored, but it's something that's very difficult, that's very hard, that's heavy. And there's this sort of ambiguity in the word that, okay, there's a glory, but there's also a, I don't know what you'd call it, a problem or a difficulty with having that.
Yeah, that's a great point. This translation, that particular phrase, "shall make my gravity felt," I actually took from Aviva Zornberg, because I mean, it's not the most of this is from most of this translation is basically JPS. But that particular phrase, I liked how she said it, "make my gravity felt," because it's, but it still has the problem, like you're saying, that it misses you don't see the connection between kavod and kaved.
In a way, it's almost untranslatable.
It's almost untranslatable, right? But the gravity sort of gets to the point you're making about the heaviness, right? It's kavod, which is like a wonderful, like the honor, but it's also very heavy. It's like you said, like there's some difficulty in some, you know, it's heavy. It's heavy, this way of making God's gravity felt. Yeah, but I like that, the connection between the two words, right? If you look in the Hebrew, Valpnei kol ha'am, right? If we see, but B'krovai kadesh valpnei kol ha'am echabed v'yidom Aaron, right? Okay. Yeah, but it's a difficult phrase to translate. That's why I used her. Okay, so what, I have trouble with this Rashi. It's a very difficult Rashi. But what is interesting about it is the idea, like I said before, like, and this is sort of using in the words of Rabbi Poland, who I said is an inspiration for much of this shiur, that it's a narrative necessity that this happened. In other words, something about the inauguration of the Mishkan as if required something to go wrong. Like it couldn't all go right. And it's interesting also, obviously, in Israel now, we're coming off of Yom HaZikaron, and I think Israelis, I mean, I actually hadn't thought about this until I moved to Israel and heard a shiur in my community about this passage, but I think that it is I don't know, possibly common understanding of this passage in light of Yom HaZikaron and like our fallen soldiers. And like we often say about our fallen soldiers, the same thing, like they're the best, like God took the best. And also the same idea that somehow in order to, for there to be a state of Israel, these deaths needed to occur, right? Like to sort of give larger meaning to the deaths. But in this case, and we'll get back to the sort of the parallel with fallen soldiers or other tragic young deaths. In this case, I loved this quote that Rabbi Poland brought from Novalis, who was a poet, a German poet in the late 18th century. It said, "In a work of art, chaos must shimmer through the veil of order." In other words, Vayikra is a very, very ordered book, and everything that's going on now in order to lead up to this moment of the inauguration of the Mishkan is a lot about order. I wanted to like come back to Sivan is there, right? Sivan asked a question at the end of last class, like, do all these details need to be exactly right? Sivan, tell me if I'm saying this correctly, for the magic to happen. That's what Sivan asked at the end of the class. Sivan, if you can pitch in tell me if that's a good rephrasing. But for the most part in Vayikra, yeah?
Yeah, I was just referring to the details in rituals.
Exactly.
That there are so many exacting rules to be observed that I thought probably all that details are required for some magic to happen. You can substitute the word magic by something else, but for something to happen, the details have to be so exact. Is that the case?
Right. So in a lot of Vayikra, I think it seems that way. All the details have it to be exactly right for the magic to happen. And you don't have to use the word magic, but I think it's actually in some ways an apt word, right? And a lot of times it seems that way, like all the details have to be exactly right. Everything has to be exactly in order and exactly the way God commanded it. And then that enables the miracle to happen, God to come and consume the sacrifices, that enables the encounter with God that occurs in the tabernacle. But what this quote is telling us is that, like, ultimately, we can never get the details all right. Like, there's always chaos which shimmers through the veil of order, right? There's never, like, as much as Vayikra is an ordered book, and it's maybe one of the most, probably the most ordered book in the Bible, the chaos still breaks through. And perhaps precisely at this moment, which is sort of like the pinnacle of all this ordered preparation and all these details that need to be exactly right, like we talked about last time also, like the importance of all these small details, we see that this chaos, this death that we can't really explain, breaks through. Like it can't all be ordered. Life just isn't like that. So even in this moment of like the greatest, you know, the realization of all this ordered preparation, and it works, meaning God does come and fire does consume the sacrifices. Like the details work, the magic happens, but there's also this horrible death. There's also this chaos at the same time. So I really love that quote that Rabbi Poland brought. Okay, so that's one way of reading, and that's sort of like, I think, the classic way that more people are familiar with, that of reading this sort of consolation of Moses. He's saying that that the tabernacle was sanctified by Nadav and Avihu and by their death, and that's sort of a way of comforting Aaron. And that's who those are, you know. But if you look back in the verse itself, it doesn't say. It says those who are through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. It doesn't say who those who are close to me, who they could be. I mean, it's the most obvious read in terms of the order of the verses, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's not specified. Does any have any other ideas who it could be before we see what the Rashbam says? Who else it could be talking about? Okay, so let's look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam, I think, has a very novel reading of this verse. Does someone want to read? Susan, you want to read the Rashbam? She's still there?
Do you want me to read that in English then?
Yeah.
Yes,
in English. We're going to be doing all the readings in English since.
Yeah.
Right, Evie? That's like the way it is. Yeah. Okay.
It's good. Just wake me up a little bit.
Okay,
This is not according to the Pshat. What is not according to the Pshat?
So he's responding to Rashi, right? Rashi's idea that Rashi's explanation of what Moses said to
Rashi's
Aaron.
explanation that somebody had to die.
Yeah, that God said ahead of time, even like Rashi's basically saying God said, and Rashi, it's not Rashi, it's the Midrash, the Rashi's quoting, but that God said ahead of time that through that someone's going to die as part of the Mishkan, that this is going to be necessary for the sanctification.
Okay. So this is not according to the Pshat. Would God have announced to Moses, and let them make me a sanctuary, and on that very day the greatest among you will die?
Right? I mean, I think it feels like what we felt also, like it's a kind of appalling idea. This is necessary. Or that God would tell them ahead of time. Okay, so how does he explain it?
Moses said to Aaron, do not mourn or weep, and do not desist from carrying on with your priestly duties. I am telling you, this is what God meant by saying, those who are close to me through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. I want to be sanctified by the high priest, the ones who are near me and who perform the service for me. I do not want them to desecrate my name and my holy service. In the presence of the whole people, I shall make my honor felt. This is the honor according to God's presence, that even when one sees one's sons dying, one ignores one's grief and continues with the service to one's creator. And Aaron was silent. He desisted from his mourning, did not weep, and did not perform the rites of mourning. Yeah, you're right, Rachel. This is a very popular kind of explanation of what we're meant to feel for soldiers who die, especially in Yom Zikaron. Actually, the rabbi, the father of one of our fallen soldiers, who is a rabbi, spoke about this.
We spoke about
at
this
the cemetery.
on this Yom this week.
No,
or the
actually, he
past?
spoke about how mourning for children is really something that never ends, and he took the pasuk of the next thing that happens, where Hashem says to Owen, what are the other two called? Itamar, the other two sons, he says, why would he have to say that they were the remaining sons? And that showed that God, according to David Levy, that showed that God also understands that you'll always, a parent who's mourning will always be mourning and always see these are the ones who are left, but he'll never forget the ones who are missing.
Yeah, it's definitely, the story is used a lot.
But that's later on
Yeah.
in the Psukim.
Yeah, I know, I want to get to that. The rest of the chapter is also fascinating. And also, like, if you think about like, he basically calls them the same words that we use for the leftovers of sacrifices. The notarim. It's the same exact root, which is also fascinating. Is someone saying something? Yeah. So according to this, who are the ones close to him that Moses is talking about? Not Nadav and Abihu, but who is sanctifying God's name in this, according to the Rashbam? Exactly. Aaron and the high priest they are the ones close to God who are sanctifying God. And how are they doing it? They're doing it by continuing to live their lives and continuing, despite this horrible tragedy, to serve God, which is a very powerful read. And we'll get to the part, and Aaron was silent, he desisted. I mean, right, when they say Aaron was silent, he desisted from his mourning, that's again referring to the right after this story. Moses says that Aaron and his sons should not take on the outward forms of mourning, that it's not appropriate right now because it's the 8th day, because it's the inauguration of the Mishkan, and it's not appropriate, and they should stop their mourning. But we'll get to that later. But I just thought this is a very powerful read, that really, how is God going to be sanctified? Not by the people who died, but by the people who continue living in the wake of the death, and how they continue to live and continue to sanctify God, despite or accompanied with this horrible tragedy that happens. Okay, yeah, Susan, you want to add?
I just want to say that that's also very, I'm sorry to say, but that's also very usual and popular, if one can use that word, explanation about people who die by terrorists. You know, the tragedy of these women of the D family who are killed. Like, that's, you know, there's a lot of learning going on in their names, and you know, the Ilui Neshama, to learn in somebody's names, like not just to ignore one's grief, but to continue with service to Creator somehow, to make this person's death more meaningful by learning more Torah.
Right, by continuing like the good things that they started in their merit. Yeah, exactly. Yes, definitely see that. Okay, so I want to turn now a bit to this phrase, Aaron was silent. Okay, and what's interesting, if you look back in the Hebrew, is that the word for being silent in Hebrew is Vayidom Aaron, right? Vayidom Aaron right here, which is not like the usual term one might expect. It's sort of an unusual phrase. What might one expect? What word might one expect for was silent in Hebrew? Any ideas? Yeah, Maureen.
Like
Yeah,
sheket?
Yeah, or shatak, right?
Yeah, shituk.
Right, shituk, exactly. So this is like a much more evocative word, we see it. I wanted to bring, does anyone know of any other places that we see this word?
Yes, but it's not coming to me. But I was also thinking, I mean, I'm sorry to go back, but I was just thinking,
Yeah.
like that idea that the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to mourn for his children because that's what God expects, that's also very strange to me. You know, I mean, I think the Jewish concept of what you do when somebody dies feels pretty laid out. And you know, I mean, I haven't studied it so thoroughly, but I don't think that there are exceptions generally. You know, this is what you're expected to do. And
Yeah, so yes, yes.
so that the idea that I mean, ha'efech, it seems strange to me that the idea that the Kohen Gadol, so important what the Kohen Gadol is doing, that he doesn't pause to mourn. You know, yeah, that's strange to me. So
yeah,
something like
I think,
the mama, I don't, I'm trying to remember where it's used, and I definitely, oh, here it is. Okay, yeah.
yeah, here it is.
Yoshua, I see it.
But
Okay.
before we get to that, just in response to what you're saying, I think the text itself struggles with this question, like, can we really expect Aaron to do this, and his sons, also the brothers, right, Elazar and Itamar? And we'll see if we can get to it at a later time, but there is a little bit of a back and forth between Moses and Aaron, and eventually, and Aaron's able to say, like, okay, up till this point, like at some point, Moses gets upset at the brothers, at Elazar and Itamar, for not eating the sin offering. And Moses like, and Aaron's like, their brothers just died. You expect them to like sit there and like have this feast, you know, like what's going on? And Moses says, okay, I accept, all right, like I understand. So I think the text itself also, you know, has some trouble with this idea. Yes, Sivan, and then I want to.
I don't think there is any struggle. It's just that when God says don't mourn for your children, which deviates from Jewish customs and practices, it implies that, okay, this is not an ordinary event. This is something extraordinary. And you being Kohen Gadol, your children's lives I've taken, and this is not something ordinary, and they are not ordinary, you're not ordinary. And it also confirms with what Moses says, that get on with your work and don't neglect your priestly duties. And all that goes on to imply that this is something that is beyond common.
Yeah, right. So it's an exception to the rule. In other words, this is such an extraordinary situation that that extraordinary measures, an extraordinary response is called for. They're extraordinary people. This is an extraordinary situation. But then again, Aaron pushes back a little bit and says, like, Adkan, like, we're not that extraordinary. Let them be a little bit human here, you know? Like, at least don't make them feast on this sacrifice on the day their brothers died. Yeah, Donna?
This supports the idea that the Torah is metaphor. It's not a real story, and that this is what I heard recently, but it's a metaphor that we try to interpret, and then you don't have to kind of struggle with it in quite the same way.
So right, so that could be, you know, one approach, which leads to somewhat different, right, different interpretations. What?
Even if it's not a metaphor, I don't think it's just a metaphor. It's to be explained away as a metaphor. But even the way the lives were taken out, that their soul was pulled out, and their body and clothing remained intact. And even going one step further, it's not every day that God directly takes out the life of a person. And this is a direct action by God directly on Aaron's children. That again is extraordinary. I mean, God takes out someone's life for negative qualities in him, and at the same time when the person is an exceptional person, probably an extraordinary event such as God directly taking the life of a person happens. And so those are the elements that can probably explain that this is out of the ordinary, and this is not to be confused with everyday events like like an ordinary person's death and murder or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, hey, this is a huge question. We're not gonna be able to answer this question now, and I do want to get back to the rest of the sources. So, okay, so where does this word dom come? Like, where do we see this? So, one big example is we see in the story Joshua, where the sun stands still. They're fighting the Amorites. And God makes the sun stand still in order to finish the battle. So here it says Shemesh Begivon Dom, right? So in other words, so here what does dome mean? It doesn't so much mean silence as still, right? That the sun is should, right? The sun is something that should be moving, that always moves, right? That's like the natural order of events, and it stops, right? God stops, like which is very interesting to think of in terms of the God's Aaron's silence, right? Like he maybe has so many things to say and he doesn't say it, or who knows? But like it's like not the natural thing, the natural order of events, right? And then another very famous place is in the Kol Dmama Daka in Kings 1, right, which is the revelation to Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? And he said, go, I think I'm just going to read because we're a little bit running out of time here. And he said, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice, right? And that's where God was, which is very interesting, of course, in contrast to what we just saw, where God was in the fire. Here, the fire is in this still small voice, and still, right, is the translation of Dmama. Right, small is daka, right? So here it's obviously not silence because it's a voice, it's noise, it's a sound, but it's still, it's like something about it, it's like either without movement or small, not entirely clear, but like something's like restrained about it. And what I also found interesting in this story is that in this passage is that God, it's a revelation of God. In other words, this is another manifestation of God. In our story, we see God in the fire, but God can also be manifest and here in a still small voice, and maybe even in Aaron's silence in some sort of way. So where do we take them? Yeah.
Can I make a comment? In both of these cases, even though dome is indicating an absence of action, they're both very, very powerful. That absence is unleashing a great force. And perhaps, in these two examples, 11 and 12, that the sun standing still is enabling a military victory. And in the next one, the still small voice is a manifestation of God. Both of these, even though there's almost an absence, there's also this incredible power. So perhaps when it's saying that Aaron is quiet, we're not actually saying he's silent, or I mean, in a sense, we're saying that, but we're also saying that he has kavod. I mean, he is powerful. He is
right. I really like, thank you. I really like that idea. In other words, it's an absence, but it's a very powerful absence. It's an absence that's a powerful presence. It's like a stillness that's powerful in its presence. Okay. I really like that. Okay. So two possible interpretations based on this. So Rebbe Eliezer Lippman Lichtenstein says that we use vayidom rather than vayishtok because it's sort of something even deeper than being quiet. That it's, again, he's sort of going in the direction of Rashi, that it denotes inner peace, that Aaron's actually somehow he's come to terms with what happened, which seems a bit surprising, but he was not simply quiet, but actually vayidom here, emphasizing that his heart and soul were at peace within, that he did not engage in questioning the standards of the Holy One of blessing at all. Rather, he justified the divine verdict. In other words, he was at peace. He believed that what God did was okay, was justified. Abarbanel goes in the opposite direction, and he says that what does it mean? It means his heart turned to lifeless stone, because domain literally means mineral. And he did not weep and mourn like a bereaved father, nor did he accept Moses' consolation, for his soul had left him and he was speechless. In other words, he was just in total shock, which is also a very, a normal step in a horrible tragedy just occurred, just to be in shock. He was just entirely in shock. His voice left him. He had no words. He had nothing. He was just in shock. He turned to stone. His heart turned to stone, which I think is a beautiful image. So we only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to sort of sum up. First, by looking at Aviva Zornberg, who has an amazing book on Vayikra, which I'm sure we'll come back to again later in this class, The Hidden Order of Intimacy, Reflections on the Book of Leviticus. So she says, God's violent gesture is intended to regenerate the religious sense of the incalculable gravity of his presence. The only words of explanation he offers are enigmatic. Through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified. In the presence of the whole people, I shall make my gravity felt, ikaved. The death of the young priest is a reminder of the dangers of everyday life with God. So again, if we come back to our original question of this image of fire, there's something like dangerous about this manifestation of God and this way of relating to God. This is a story that has generated many stories meeting, but Aaron's response is silence, and Aaron was silent. Perhaps this is the appropriate response. In itself, it bears many possibilities. Does Aaron's silence signify assent to God's enigmatic summation? Through those who are close to me, I shall be sanctified, or resignation, or tight-lipped self-control? Silence holds many possibilities. The narrative of Nadav and Avihu gives us perhaps too many possibilities, with an unresolved gap in the midst of each. What is not explained or reduced to narrative order is the divine itself. What cannot be fully known, I shall become what I shall become, makes us both hopeful and hopeless. So in other words, this story, it represents the mystery of God, what we can never even expect to fully understand. Meaning the through those that are close to me, I shall be sanctified. It's not according to what she's saying, it's the chaos, it's the mystery. We can't, there aren't any really good explanations. And just to finish up with a personal account from, Blue Greenberg, married to Yitz Greenberg, they lost their son young. He was 36 in a tragic bike accident. And she talks about her grappling with this. And I'm just going to read this to end off. With this passage, when my husband and I sat Shiva, most people came with no forethought, agenda, or explanation, though a few, out of good intention and compassion, tried to justify God or soften the loss by giving it some meaning. He was so good that God needed him by his side, right? Which is basically Rashi's explanation of how Moses was comforting Aaron. Was one such attempt, to which on one occasion, unable to hold back my words, I responded, but we on earth and more. Most people understand at the deepest level that there was nothing that could justify, nothing that could offset the pain or soften the blow, and they wisely remained silent. And we ourselves were silent, as there were no words we could speak that would make any sense of it. The Jewish laws of bereavement, so exquisitely tuned to the needs of the mourners, stipulate that the Shiva visitor should not speak until the mourner speaks. I'd always thought that the point of that precept was to ensure that the conversation would flow to the place that the mourner needs it to reach. But I now understand that the halacha, Jewish law, enjoining the comforting visitor to hold back in silence, serves a different function, to caution against offering a rationale for the decree of death. The deeper human religious response is to be silent, to live with the contradiction, right? To live with the mystery, the chaos, and to affirm that we need not force meaning into tragedy. Sometimes the deepest response of love is to be silent. So I wanted to see that the time is up. So I wanted to officially end the class, but like last time, and thank everybody for all their contributions. But like last time, I'll stay on, and
I think Donna, Donna, did you have a...
Yeah, and I'm happy to be here. Questions. So yeah, Donna, go ahead. But anyone who needs to leave, it's 10 o'clock. So 10 o'clock my time, 3 o'clock your time, and I want to let anyone leave who wants to. Yes, Donna.
The supreme irony is that I'm looking at the parents of you, the child, and whom I know very well, and thinking of how, it's sort of this whole layer here of how they would feel, how I would feel, and it just is ironic that that is tied into this whole discussion.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Does anyone else have questions, comments, responses that they want to add?
Yeah, I have something, Rachel. It's Maureen.
Yeah. Go ahead, Maureen.
We just read maybe a week ago about Miriam getting Tzora'at, and there also Aharon's response is silence. He also there too, he says nothing. So I wonder if it speaks to the character of Aharon, that he feels, just thinking of him as a human being, that he feels things so deeply that he's unable to express his emotions in words. I mean, it's interesting that we have two examples of it in the Torah.
Interesting.
I think one way by which people of exalted stature communicate is by silence. I mean, especially of a spiritually exalted stature, and through silence also they communicate quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the silence itself, like my father was saying, right, is powerful. It's not only an absence; it's also a presence. It's also powerful in and of itself. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I hadn't thought about that connection with Tzora'at, Maureen. That's interesting to look closer. Well, if we get to Tzora'at, then we'll see also that connection. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you not only to those who joined us here on Zoom, but also those who watched us live on Facebook, and many, many thanks to you, Rachael Gelfman Schultz. Very interesting class. And thank you so much again, Rachel. We'll see you next week.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. See you next week.